If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell. I just love those lines. I think that's the kind of stuff, say what you will about Lord of the Rings, like that's a awesome sentiment, and I think it's one that champions peace and friendship over greed and violence. That has got broad appeal. Welcome, friends, to episode 242 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss J.R.R. Tolkien's 1937 novel, The Hobbit. Tolkien, James.
Yeah, I think we learned that from when we did the bonus episode, the Tolkien biopic.
Yeah. How much do you think we're going to say it the right way versus the wrong way, if you had to bet a split on it?
I don't know, 80-20?
80-20 wrong way?
Incorrect, yeah.
Yeah,
80% of the time.
At least. Tolkien is definitely the way I say it casually, and I've always heard it said, and I don't know, I want to respect the guy's pronunciation, so I'll try Tolkien. But it's just tough when I feel like pop culture has taught us all the wrong way.
And that kind of gets to the roots of some of what I want to talk about with the story, is that this story is so ingrained, and I think probably both of us, but definitely myself, in terms of just being I don't know, something that I can point to that was a big turning point in my storytelling journey, something that I'll bring it up now. I was going to mention it later, but just I had this moment where I was contemplating what life would look like without having come into contact with this so early on and when I was a kid, and yeah, just what the story means to myself, and it's emotional, and it draws you in this really, I think, unique way and sort of a monumental way. But then it's also it's so impactful for all fantasy today. What would fantasy look like without J.R.R. Tolkien?
I mean, he's widely considered the father of high fantasy. Some people say grandfather. His works are foundational for what, especially in the West, we think of with high fantasy in particular. And you look at games like Dungeons and Dragons, and you look at many things that have just continued that legacy, and you can tie it right back to him. Now, he didn't invent all this stuff, which we'll talk about where he was drawing from, but popularized it. And we spent a lot of time talking about Tolkien in our Fellowship of the Ring. I think our first Fellowship of the Ring episode. And then maybe, I don't know, we probably touched on it again throughout.
We should mention the number of times that we've covered J.R.R. Tolkien projects. Just to list them, we did Fellowship of the Ring first, followed by Two Towers. And when we did them, as we always do, novel into the film.
Yeah, and we did 3 episodes on each book. So 4 total episodes. So that's 12 for the first 3 movies. Plus we did the bonus of Ralph Bakshi's animated, and then we did the Rankin Bass animated. So that's 2 additional, and then we did a Tolkien biopic. So I think that's up to 15 episodes on him now. We also did a Michael Moorcock essay talking about Lord of the Rings, if you want to count that as a 16th episode. This would be number 17. Holy cow.
We're looking at least 20 to 30 hours worth of Tolkien and this world, I think.
Absolutely. So there's lots of content out there if you want to find out our thoughts on that. But the reason I bring that up is I was able to find some really cool background stuff that I want to touch on, but I'm not going to be describing Tolkien's life in detail because I feel like we've already covered that. So just to make you aware of what we're going to do here. I wanted to ask you about your actual history reading this thing. Can you remember when you first encountered it and in what form?
I came to it after the first Fellowship of the Ring film came out, Peter Jackson's first Fellowship. So 2001, started reading the Lord of the Rings, the trilogy, and then realized The Hobbit, I should start there. Went back, read The Hobbit before finishing Fellowship of the Ring, and it kind of informs everything, obviously. The Hobbit struck me perfectly. I was oh my God, this is I think I
So what was
appreciated
your
it much
age
more.
at that time? If you had
I
to
would have
guess?
been like 8.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you would have been, that's like target age range for this
Yeah.
book, honestly. So
Eventually, I don't know, I should have looked up the year that this came out, but there was a Game Boy game that came out, the Hobbit Game Boy game.
Really?
And I played the absolute hell out of that game.
That's
and it was
cool.
so cool too because it was very book accurate. Like some of the things that maybe were cut out from the films that we're going to talk about at some point, that game was so fun, and it really like allowed me to get immersed in that world.
Okay. So for me, this is one of my foundational fantasy stories, right? Like as you talked about, it laid a lot of groundwork for me in my love of fantasy. It was not the first one I encountered. I know my mother read to me The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which at some point we'll cover.
Chronicles of Narnia.
Chronicles of Narnia, yeah, and some Redwall, and so there was some other fantasy that I think that actually came in before. However, as long as I can remember, I was watching the animated version, the animated adaptation of The Hobbit, and it was one of my favorite movies. We had recorded it off of the TV, with your, VCR, record something that was like aired with commercials and stuff, and then like you would try and like either stop it so that you didn't record the commercials or what have you.
I had a Star Wars trilogy marathon recorded off of TNT for personally. That's like my reference for that.
Yeah,
sure.
and that was how I watched it, and I think I wore that tape out. We maybe bought another version of it because I wore it out, if I remember correctly. Like it was one of my. Like, everybody has like a movie that they watch like a million times as a kid. I had a few of them, I guess. 101 Dalmatians was one of them for me.
I watched The Lion King every day.
Yeah, but eventually it was The Hobbit, and Hobbit was a big one. And then I remember my parents telling me it was a book, but it wasn't until I was in this program through school called Book It. Did you participate in the Book It program?
I don't think so. Is that like gifted kind of thing?
No, I don't think it was through Gifted. Anyway, the whole point of Book It is you read these books and you get credit for them. I think you have to take like a comprehension test. I may be mixing it up with something else, but I think that's how it worked. And then you would get credit for it, and then you would get a free personal pan pizza at Pizza Hut.
Oh yeah, I totally remember that. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think I did a lot of it, but I remember that being a thing.
I was all about it, man.
Yeah.
Love pizza, love Pizza Hut, and I was definitely doing that to read. And like I was looking for books, and then I found The Hobbit, and I remember I had an illustrated edition that is now lost to time. Who knows whatever happened to that thing? But that was my first experience reading it. But I had seen it so many times already in the animated version.
That's really interesting. So you actually watched it before reading, and I read it before watching it. So we have different Hobbit like exposure.
Yeah, but all of that was before Lord of the Rings. I hadn't read or seen Lord of the Rings at all. And in fact, I didn't read Lord of the Rings until after I'd seen the first movie, I think, and then I read.
That's kind of where I was at with it. I started Fellowship and then jumped back to The Hobbit. So
It's messy, and it's funny because I feel like if you listen back to our Lord of the Rings coverage, I probably claim some different stuff about when I read and saw each movie and like read each book, because I honestly don't remember. I know I didn't finish the series originally when I first picked it up. I don't remember how far I got. Anyway, it's kind of messy, but because of that, the adaptations and the source material has always been kind of blended in my mind. And I remember reading this illustrated edition, liking some of the illustrations, but then also comparing them to the animated film I'd seen. And like that was the version of it in my head, and being like, this is weird. It looks different. I don't know if I like this. Anyway, it's just, I wonder if that had anything to do with like my fascination with adaptations, maybe. I don't know.
yeah. I remember going into a bookstore and kind of there wasn't a lot of people that were pointing me to like fantasy novels or just like specific novels in general. I was reading a lot of like whatever came my way. We would go to the library a lot. I would pick up books that way. And I remember going into a bookstore, and my parents didn't, especially when I was very young, didn't like buy me a ton of things like that. But I remember seeing The Hobbit on the shelf and knowing that it was like associated with Fellowship, and like grabbing it. And I have this vivid memory of grabbing it, and the cover was like this all green, and it's just got like Bag End on it, and like asking if we could get it, and they got it. So it's this weird thing where I think back to it, and it feels very like
This one?
momentous. That looks like it. I think so.
I'm holding up my
Maybe.
copy into the camera so James can see it. It's all green and it has bag end on it, so it's similar. It might not be they've done a lot of editions of this book over the years.
My memory of it was like more like less illustration, just like a really small circle.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, they've done all kinds of stuff like that.
But so if like thinking back, just like how random the universe is and how like I happened to pick it up, and I probably would have read it eventually just based on like my interests and everything. But I picked it up knowing that it was somewhat associated with Fellowship, and then like my parents bought it for me, which was like kind of a big deal at the time. And just reading it, I remember it really, really digging its hooks into me in a way that not many books had at that time. And yeah, and so that's part of what I was talking about earlier is just I think of it so fondly. And even today when I read it, there's a certain bias that's there, and just to like be predisposed to love the story, I think. And it's like it's hard to kind of step outside, but I do feel like I can step outside, and I have some new perspectives on it that I'd like to bring up.
Yeah.
With this most recent reading.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's hard not to view this thing through nostalgia, rose-tinted glasses, because I have so many fond memories of it growing up, and it does feel foundational for me. Among with other works, like I want to shout out Jane Yolen's Dragon's Blood, I think it was called. It was just like a very early fantasy novel for me, so it's not the only one. It's one of a few, though, that were early on and set me down this path of loving fantasy, being interested in Dungeons & Dragons, wanting to be a fantasy author when I was very young. I wanted to be an author, and specifically an author of fantasy, probably since elementary school. Yeah. When I first kind of discovered that it was a job someone could theoretically have, I was like, well, that's what I want to do. And it was paleontologist, and then it became author, basically.
I love that. That's awesome.
So, it's an important work for me, but then that also reflects how important I think it has been for Western literature, and especially fantasy, high fantasy literature. And it is, I think, important to distinguish between The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. They are actually, different in significant ways. One is a children's book, and one is not. One is this like adult epic, essentially. And The Hobbit is a prequel to The Lord of the Rings, and it's often kind of thought that way, but it was written long before. So when it was written, it actually was not positioned to be that way. He had not written Lord of the Rings yet. And in fact, as we'll get into, there was some revisions made to The Hobbit to make it line up with The Lord of the Rings later, so that it would be more consistent. It's an interesting story, and that's something I want to kind of dive into, is like specific details about The Hobbit that we probably didn't touch on too much when we were covering The Lord of the Rings. But I think that's actually a good place to start too, is like, this is a book for kids, and it was designed that way from the jump. And so because of that, it has a different tone. It has this omniscient narrator who is sort of playful and addresses the reader directly, and says things like, found his way to this through the tunnels, as well as you and me might find our way to the nearest post office.
Golf was invented by hobbits with an orc head rolling into a hole.
Yeah, it's these fun little moments, right? These little jokes, and it kind of breaks the immersion a little bit, but also in like a playful way.
I think the idea is that in some way, this is a history of our world, like an ancient history of our world, or something like that is trying to be said in this book that's kind of dropped for anything Lord of the Rings related.
A little bit. The tone of it's definitely changed. And this sort of playful tone, I actually read later that Tolkien actually retroactively was not a big fan of it. And it seems like he kind of wished he had done it differently. But at the time, it was considered one of the selling points of the novel. It was praised. And I think it made it very approachable for kids, right? So kids are picking this up and they find it approachable. They find the tone lighthearted. And I think it lessens some of that like bewilderment of being in a fantasy world where everything's different. It really works as a children's novel in that respect. So let's just, I guess, briefly give general thoughts of how we felt reading it now as adults who've covered, Tolkien for 20, 30 hours, however many we've done now. How did it change for you as an adult reading it?
I was really concentrating on form, I think, this time, and like the structure of what Tolkien was setting out to do. And I read somewhere, long ago, that he was writing this for his children, right? Like this was sort of a story that was being built up kind of for his children, and then eventually
we'll get into the backstory of that.
So I was kind of viewing it through that lens and thinking of what who's reading this to his kids as bedtime stories, and I was noticing that the structure of like the chapters were almost like episodes, where it's like very self-contained. A new entity is introduced, some sort of threat or some sort of like adventure that they're going through. A new setting seems to be set up in each area, in each chapter. And that feels very readable to like someone reading to their kids. Like, let me read this chapter to you. It'll take me maybe half hour to an hour to read it. And it'll be this one-off adventure that we'll go on, and we'll follow Bilbo through like his overarching adventure, but also like one kind of quest at a time. Which I thought it's so readable. It makes it very readable. It feels like there's like checkpoints that you're hitting. That something about like reading when you're young. I think that helps you feel like you're moving along. And then just like we talked about, the references to our world and some of the riddles and the word games that he's playing, and this introduction to like what you can do with the written word other than just deliver information. The way that you can sort of play with that. I thought about, like I said, the legacy of the story and like what fantasy would have been like if without Tolkien, and what my journey, like I just can't think of, because I'm so in love with these sort of fantasy worlds and a lot of the things that people have taken and run with, and a lot of the stuff that he was pulling from, those classic stories that are very archetypal. Just thinking of like what it means to me and how when I think of a dragon, I think of first Lord of the Rings. When I think of any goblins or elves, like I'm thinking first of Tolkien's elves. And, I don't know that, I don't know. I do worry that he sort of swallows up the market. And I think we've talked about that a lot, the fantasy market, in kind of unhealthy ways at times. And people can be stuck in just Tolkien's world. But it is, for my experience, and I've continued to read outside Tolkien, obviously, I recommend that heavily. It is just such a amazing story that exists as it does. And I think of The Hobbit as like an archetypal fantasy story. And I was thinking about it in comparison to things that he was referencing, like your Beowulfs and things like that he was clearly drawing from. And there's this subversive thing that happens in The Hobbit where you're following along this journey, this sort of straightforward journey would be you get to the dragon and the gold and the riches, and then everything sort of ends happily ever after. But there's this also added on like fourth act almost, that it subverts a lot and it changes what you think of good and evil a little bit, and like how the characters have developed, and not to say, it's not spoilers, I don't think, to say that like the dwarves are kind of have something that happens in the fourth act that makes you question them.
Well, I wanted to bring that up, actually. Just let me stop you there. I think we go full spoilers for this. This is not going to be coverage for children. We're going to curse during this coverage. So this is not, unless you're, as the McElroys say, cool babies. It's not designed for children. And also, I think at this point everybody knows the story of The Hobbit. I think it's safe to say. So yeah, let's talk about things specifically.
Okay. So the dwarves go from being this merry band that they're all traveling with, and we start to learn about the greed of the dwarves. And as we get closer, their greed is more clear. And it takes Bilbo, our main character, realizing that the people he's been traveling with and the people he's friends with, he might have to disagree with and go against. And I feel like that's very anti the sort of story that Tolkien was referencing in a way. So he's kind of moving along the medium in a way that I think people have taken his work and moved it along into newer avenues as well. I'm not saying that he's the first person to do something like this, but it does, in a story that I think of as very archetypal, it does feel subversive to add on this extra bit where our hero Bilbo looks at his companions and sees they're fallible, and decides to go against them kind of near the end, and like, I think it helps to show, obviously, Bilbo's arc as well, like his growth over time, the way that he's willing to stand up for what he believes is right. And sort of like, the end of the story would be you kill the dragon, you get the riches, and everybody's happy. But there is something about like the status quo that I think is actually broken in The Hobbit, where that's not what happens necessarily. Ultimately, we do end on that happy ending, but not before a lot of other things fall out, and there's some
real drama, political drama plays
good
out.
drama, and really it's a lot darker than what the children's story sets out to tell in the very beginning. I think it builds to something a lot more complex.
Okay, so for me, reading this book as an adult definitely changes things a bit, especially with, all the coverage we've done and the way that I read things for the podcast in specific. Because I'm looking for themes. I'm looking for hidden meanings. I'm looking for, especially when it's something I've covered this much, right, and I'm this familiar with, I'm trying to dig deeper. And I'm trying to look for, like, what else can I prize from the pages of this book? And in some ways, this book works really well doing that, right? Because I see the philology background. I see that this is sort of a meditation on storytelling in general and mythology and the way we teach lessons to children. There's so many cool things like that you prize out of there. But then also to me, it became very apparent that there are no women in this entire book, basically. A lot of the fantasy races being employed here by Tolkien have very unfortunate real-world comparisons that people have drawn and that Tolkien has sort of owned up to on different occasions. And, obviously we've talked about the orcs and the goblins in the past with Lord of the Rings, potential problems there. Goblins also could represent, I was reading the Germans at the time and sort of their industrial
anti-nature kind of
and looking back at World War I, his experience in World War I with that. But then also I've seen him basically say that the dwarves are Jewish, and he broadly based them on Jewish people, like their history of being driven from their homeland.
Wow.
And then when you think of it that way and you start looking at the way they're described and their quote unquote greed and like all this stuff, it gets pretty messy pretty quick.
One of the biggest things that happens with this too is it would be one thing if there were like stereotypical things within the races, but then he goes as far as to say this race is evil, this race is good.
Yeah.
And that spectrum that he creates there, which I think like if you draw the comparisons is problematic for sure.
Yeah. So, we're looking at a book now that's almost 100 years old. So, it's always going to be, when you start viewing things from the lens of modernity and you look at something that's never going to age like perfectly. But I think, there are a lot of people out there who've in recent years, and I'm sure have been ringing the bells for a long time now, are saying like, hey, maybe there's some stuff we should, be looking at here and not completely blindly lionizing. And, even beyond that, I was thinking about how personally, I think the character of Bombor taught me some fat phobia stuff from a very early age, because Bombor is considered, he's kind of the butt of a lot of jokes. He at times is seen as like a burden on the others. He is, he's just not dealt with in a great way, and he's the only character who's repeatedly like described as being fat. And it's this kind of stuff. It's like that doesn't seem like a big deal, and a lot of people are probably rolling their eyes. And like I agree, it's not that huge of a deal. But when you're very, very young and you read that, like you start to internalize things. And so like I'd be a little bit hesitant. Like if I read this book to my kid, if I had a kid, I would want to talk to them about this and specifically and say like, hey, let's not take the wrong lessons from this. It's a product of his own life and his own upbringing and the stuff that he was around and internalized. It's not necessarily forgive it, but like I think it does kind of explain it and like the society he lived in. He was in academia. He was a professor at Oxford. It was a college of Oxford that he was at, Pembroke College, but it is a constituent college of Oxford. So we're talking about an Oxford professor of Anglo-Saxon studies and philology, right? Like he is around a very specific crowd. The college he teaches at, boys only, and was boys only until 1979. And this is a 300-year-old college. So, this is like, he's in this world, he went in the army, which was obviously only men. So like he grew up in a very patriarchal society. And that is reflected in his writing, and for better and worse. I think mostly for worse, but like I think it also explains it.
It's a good example of like where we should be aware of these things, right? Like being aware of our own environment and what we're internalizing and what we see and are not exposed to.
Yeah. Anyway, so I don't want to be a bummer with it because like ultimately I had a good time. It is a important novel for me. Like I said, foundational. It's just like when you start looking at it through these lenses as you're trying to figure out like what am I going to talk about on a podcast, it's hard to ignore. when you start thinking about it in that way. But there's a lot of like great themes in here. There's a lot of really good lessons, I think, that can be imparted to kids, and I'm excited to like get into those as we actually discuss the plot. But before we get into the plot, I think let's touch on some of these background details I was able to find. So, as I've already said, professor of Anglo-Saxon, I guess, studies? I don't know, it doesn't really say. At Pembroke College, at the time that he wrote this, in the 1930s. At the time, he had published several poems in magazines and small collections, which included Goblin Feet and The Cat and the Fiddle, a nursery rhyme undone and its scandalous secret unlocked. So, a poem from that is called The Man in the Moon Stayed Up Too Late. Tolkien's original song, which was imagined to be set to the nursery rhyme, Hey Diddle Diddle, The Cat and the Fiddle. So to that sort of rhyme scheme and tune. It was first published in the Yorkshire Poetry in 1923, so this is 14 years before The Hobbit. However, he would later reuse it in an extended form in his 1954 to 1955 Lord of the Rings as a song sung by Frodo Baggins in the Prancing Pony Inn. So he literally had Frodo sing a poem that he wrote in the 20s. In the extended edition of Peter Jackson's 2012 film, The Hobbit and Unexpected Journey, the dwarf Bofur sings it at Elrond's feast in Rivendell. So that's something to look out for. We watched the extended edition. Bofur singing a poem in the extended version that is one of Tolkien's first published works, which I think is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Speaking of the background of this, right? He had been writing these letters to his children, and they're called the Letters from Father Christmas. These would later be published, I think posthumously. But he would write these letters to his kids about Father Christmas, which included his elves, it included warring gnomes and goblins, and a helpful pair of polar bears, alongside the creation of the elven languages and an attendant mythology, including the Book of Lost Tales, which he had been working on since 1917. So he was building this mythology, and it was all interconnected and related, and then he started doing these letters from Father Christmas to his kids. Speaking of those letters from Father Christmas, Paul H. Coker suggested that the creatures in the Father Christmas letters may have been a precursor to those which appeared in Tolkien's later works. For example, it was suggested that the wizard Gandalf may have been developed from Father Christmas. So if you think about it, Gandalf is kind of a Santa Claus figure. Kind of makes sense.
I can see it.
So he's developing this mythology around Father Christmas and his elves for his kids, right? And then, like, they're like on an expedition and they get attacked by goblins. And then, like, that's all when he's developing this mythos. So in a 1955 letter to W.H. Auden, who Tolkien became friends with, this is a famous poet, if you're unfamiliar, Tolkien recollects that he began work on The Hobbit one day in early 1930s when he was marking school certificate papers. He found a blank page. Suddenly inspired, he wrote the words, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." By late 1932, he had finished the story and then lent the manuscript to several friends, including C.S. Lewis and a student of Tolkien's named Elaine Griffiths. From Griffith, it would pass through several hands before arriving at Stanley Unwin, who then asked his 10-year-old son, Rayner, to review it. So Unwin was a publisher. Unwin paid his 10-year-old son a shilling to write a report on the manuscript, and Rayner gave it favorable comments, which settled in Unwin's decision to publish the book. And I have 10-year-old Rayner's comments here. So this is the first person, the first kid to ever read The Hobbit, if you think about it that way. Bilbo Baggins was a hobbit who lived in his hobbit hole and never went for adventures. At last, Gandalf the wizard and his dwarves persuaded him to go. He had a very exciting, he misspelled exciting, time fighting goblins and wargs. At last, they got to the Lonely Mountain. Smaug, the dragon who guards it, is killed after a terrific battle with the goblins. He returned home rich. The book, with the help of maps, does not need any illustrations and is good and should appeal to all children between the ages of 5 and 9. That is his son. His son would go on to become a publisher, by the way, and has since passed away. So this was a long time ago.
Yeah. I mean, you're setting your child up for success if you're having them turn in book reports when they're young like that, right?
Paid him a shilling for it, so
yeah.
I don't know how much that is. I assume it's not very much. I just thought that was, again, like a little fun detail I didn't know. And that's one of the things that convinced him to publish it, was his son's favorable review of it. So, Tolkien's works show many influences from Norse mythology, reflecting his lifelong passion for those stories and his academic interest in Germanic philology. The Hobbit is no exception to this. The work shows influences from the Northern European literature, myths, and languages. Examples include the names of the dwarves. But while their names are from Old Norse, the character dwarves are more directly taken from fairy tales, such as Snow White and the Rose Red, as collected by the Brothers Grimm. The latter tale may have also influenced the character of Bjorn. So I thought that was interesting. Right?
Yeah.
You know,
it's a former project,
tying it back to Brothers Grimm.
Even the animated film dates back to the 30s too, so Tolkien may have seen that.
And it's interesting because I remember as a kid, that was like one of the things I had seen before I saw The Hobbit, was I had seen Snow White. And I was familiar with all the dwarves, the 7 dwarves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I get The Hobbit and there's these 12 dwarves. And I remember thinking like, oh, that's just how dwarves are, I guess, in fantasy. Like it like seemed like it must be the same thing. And sure enough, it is, potentially, right? Like a heavily influenced. I read about a bunch of other influences, but one of the other big ones is Beowulf, that Tolkien is actually credited as being one of the early people to really treat Beowulf as like a serious piece of literature and sort of dawning a fantasy, as opposed to just like a historical text that's of note. Specifically, in Beowulf, there is like a big sequence with a dragon that people have said is directly echoed by Bilbo talking to Smaug.
Did you read Beowulf in school?
I didn't, actually. I think we read okay, let me correct myself. I believe we read a selection from it, but I don't think we read the entire thing, if my memory serves, and that would have been in like 7th or 8th grade, so middle school.
I think it was middle school or early high school for me as well. I think it might have been middle school. And I remember comparing it in my mind to Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, because I had read those before reading Beowulf, which was wildly interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, it goes to show that, like, Tolkien, yes, he's inspired by mythology, he's inspired by, languages and so forth, but he also is inspired by stuff that came before him by other authors. There are these other works of fantasy that have influenced him. Samuel Rutherford Crockett's historical novel, The Black Douglas, and there's a necromancer who, and Sauron was kind of based off of his villain, a character named Gilles de Retz, apparently. I don't know. I'm not familiar with The Black Douglas. Also, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are similar narrative style and to the novel. And overall imagery has been suggested to have had an influence on Tolkien. He was particularly influenced by George MacDonald's The Princess and the Goblin. And many people have noted similarities between The Hobbit and Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth from 1864. So there is, like, he was influenced by the literature of his time. And I think it's good to remember that, as much as we lionize it and sort of mythologize it, like he's a man, he's a smart guy, he's a professor who loves language and he loves mythology, but he also is reading the literature of the time, and he's sort of fusing all of that, bringing in his own experiences in the First World War, and this is what comes out of it. And I think the idea to make it a children's story ultimately was a brilliant one, and part of the reason why this went on to become so successful. Now, to tie it to Lord of the Rings, in December of 1937, The Hobbit's publisher, Stanley Unwin, that was the father of the kid we talked about earlier, asked Tolkien for a sequel. In response, Tolkien provided the drafts for the Silmarillion, but the editors rejected them, believing that the public wanted, quote, more about hobbits. Tolkien subsequently began to work on The New Hobbit, which would eventually become The Lord of the Rings. A course that would not only change the context of the original story, but lead to substantial changes to the character of Gollum. In the first edition of The Hobbit, Gollum willingly bets his magic ring on the outcome of the riddle game, and he and Bilbo part amicably.
Wow.
In the second edition edits, to reflect the new concept of the One Ring and its corrupting abilities, Tolkien made Gollum more aggressive toward Bilbo and distraught at losing the ring. The encounter ends with Gollum's curse, "Thief, thief, Baggins, we hates it, we hates it, we hates it forever." Massive change to the Riddles in Dark specifically chapter, there I was reading about some other small changes that were made to line up with the mythology that he was continuing to develop over the years that followed.
It's funny because when you mentioned earlier in this episode that there were changes that were made from different editions, I was in my mind immediately thought there's no way he changed anything from Riddles in the Dark. That seemed like it was like exactly where you wouldn't want to change anything, but turns out that was a good edit.
But because that one ties so importantly, but he had not developed the Lord of the Rings yet. He didn't know that the One Ring was going to be so important when he originally wrote it. He went back later and edited it that way. So that also shows like an interesting thing about like storytelling, right, and how things can change over time. I heard him later sort of in universe explain it as the original telling of the tale is the way that Bilbo would lie,
tells it,
and say is what happened, and then like what is in there now is what really happened. But that's just an in-universe explanation. What's interesting to me is that the idea that he was able to do this. That he was able to make these changes. Part of it is because when the book originally came out and was published all throughout the Second World War, there wasn't that many copies, and it would immediately sell out. But like there was a paper shortage, and so it wasn't until after the war ended that he were able to start producing a lot more editions of this thing. And I'm not sure exactly when the changes started happening, but he was developing the Lord of the Rings, and then he was able to start making changes so that there wasn't this massive readership who had read the early editions, because I think it was a very rare book to find. You know, the original run only included 1,500 copies, I saw. So, if you have one of those original 1,500, it's worth quite a bit of money now, I would assume. Especially if you have a signed edition.
Everybody check your bookshelves. Just
yeah,
double
if you
check.
happen to have a 1937 edition of The Hobbit, take note. Anyway, so I thought this was a lot of interesting little kind of tidbits I hadn't heard before. You know, Gandalf is possibly like kind of a Santa figure. All these different influences, tying it to Brothers Grimm. This was all kind of new to me, and I thought it was neat. But yeah, I mean, if you're ready, I guess let's get into the plot. We're going to try and move through this pretty quickly because we're going to be touching in on the plot a lot more in the coming weeks as we cover the different versions. But I would also like to say that I think the most faithful adaptation, and maybe I'll change my mind once I see it again, is the animated one. It's a beloved one of me, and I'm gonna have you watch it. We're gonna watch it, and we're gonna release it on our Patreon. So if you want to hear us discuss the Rankin Bass version of The Hobbit, that's where you're gonna find that. And then we will be covering the three Peter Jackson films, and we're going to be bringing on some old friends and potentially a new friend as well to help us get through the movies, is the way I'm putting it. But at the very least, to help us cover the three movies. And it should be fun, regardless of what you think of them. I'm hoping that our episodes will be fun. We'll talk about background for the movies, and we'll have some different perspectives to bring to the show.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I would argue that the Hobbit Game Boy Advance video game that came out from Sierra Entertainment might be one of the most faithful adaptations.
There you go.
I want to know if other people have played this game or if it was just me in this weird vacuum, but
I never heard of it.
It was a fun game.
Honest.
At the time, it was really fun.
All right, so let's start off with the first chunk of summary, and then we can dive into our thoughts. Gandalf tricks Bilbo Baggins into hosting a party for Thorin Oakenshield and his band of 12 dwarves, who sing of reclaiming their ancient home, the Lonely Mountain, and its vast treasure from the dragon Smaug. When the music ends, Gandalf unveils a map showing a secret door into the mountain and proposes that the dumbfounded Bilbo serve as the expedition's burglar. The troupe travels into the wild. Gandalf saves the company from trolls and leads them to Rivendell, where Elrond reveals more secrets from the map. When they attempt to cross the misty mountains, they are caught by goblins and driven deep underground. Although Gandalf rescues them, Bilbo gets separated from the others as they flee the goblins. Lost in the goblin tunnels, he stumbles across a mysterious ring and then encounters Gollum, who engages him in a game, each posing a riddle until one of them cannot solve it. With the help of the ring, which confers invisibility, Bilbo escapes and rejoins the dwarves, improving his reputation with them. The goblins and wargs give chase, but the company are saved by eagles. They rest in the house of Bjorn. All right, let's stop here. A lot gets covered. A lot happens in this story because it is an adventure. Like you said, it's kind of episodic. Every episode brings in a new element of the world. And as you pointed out, I think this is a great way to introduce a fantasy world to someone, because you start somewhere kind of small and familiar, and then there's like increasing levels of danger, moments of respite, and then you're introducing like a new thing. Like there's like one or two new things in every chapter that get introduced. And then it's broken up with all these songs and poems that keep the tone sort of light and fun. And again, the narrator is engaging with the reader in a very direct way. The language isn't too advanced, which you could definitely get from a philology professor if you're not careful. So, this is just set up to be incredibly inviting. And it all begins with what I think is one of the most iconic openings in all of fantasy. I think it's safe to say it is. And I'll read it real quick. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole, filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell. Nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole, with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. One of the most iconic openings of all time.
Yeah. Very evocative. You think of what it is right away, and different too. Like I mean, I don't know. I hadn't encountered anything like that before. This idea of a hobbit-like creature, but I was young when I read this, so I think I would be forgiven for not. This idea of the Hobbit and then the Shire that we get in the beginning of Fellowship. We've talked in the past about how like this could be this pastoral sort of conservative look at
Moorcock. You were thinking about Moorcock while you were reading it. I was too, man. Like it got in my head.
But this is interesting because I think in a different way, they talk about like Bilbo's took ancestry a lot and how like he has that urge to adventure.
Yeah.
Frodo, and I think this is said in the Fellowship of the Ring, like Frodo is still in love with the Shire and everything. Like when he sets out on this adventure, he's like dragged into it. I think there's something about Bilbo that wanted to adventure. And like, of course it was like half of him was split, but I wonder what it's saying if we analyze it through Moorcock's lens, if this is a person who leaves more willingly and really develops into the adventure and then wants to return at the end, but is significantly changed and doesn't seek the pleasures, I feel like, as much as Frodo kind of looks to when he returns.
So we've touched on the idea of I think it's Joseph Campbell's hero's journey several times. I think the Hobbit is like a clear example of that. You could also look at Star Wars. There's many other examples of this out there. A lot of very iconic pieces of work. I am not someone who believes that that the hero's journey is the end all be all, that that's what we should be aspiring to, that people should be writing their books this way. I think it's a mode of storytelling. It's a very popular mode of storytelling. At this point, maybe it's getting a little played. I want to see people, if they're going to engage with it, find ways to subvert it. But I mean, you look at it, right? A hero gets called to action, usually says no first, and then has to be sort of convinced to go, goes on an adventure. Through the course of the adventure is forced to grow, to change, and then triumphs over some sort of challenge, and then returns home as a changed person. And we see all of those elements are present in this book, and they're also all present in Lord of the Rings. So I think Tolkien is very deliberately structuring both the entirety of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit in the same way. And if you look at it, the stories have a lot of similarities. And I saw someone breaking it down, like beat by beat. A lot of the stuff that happens is the same. There's like being forced underground. There's the battle of the five armies versus the battle of Pelennor Fields. Ending on a mountain. You got Lonely Mountain versus the Mount Doom. You got the Eagles. You got Aragorn being similar to Bard as this like new king being restored to a country or a city to its former glory. There's all sorts of similarities when you look at it, and it's like he kind of retold the story in The Lord of the Rings of The Hobbit. He just made it, I think, more adult. And the reason I bring all this up is it brings me back to the character of Frodo, who, in my opinion, is a more nuanced and perhaps complex version of Bilbo. Because I agree, Bilbo at first says no, and at times misses home for sure, and thinks how he's in over his head. But ultimately, it seems like Bilbo's having a great time, and he sort of embraces this new role at a certain point.
He also like ends up being a bit more formidable than I think Frodo ever does. Like he actually wins some fights and does some big feats of heroics.
Yeah, against the spiders and stuff. Like he definitely has moments of heroism in different ways. Talking with Smaug I remember as a kid was inspiring to me. Like, oh my, like the bravery it would take to go in alone and trade these verbal barbs with Smaug, who's incredibly scary. An amazing scene, but also just like an incredible moment of heroism to me, or bravery, I guess I should say. And yeah, time and again we see that. We see the way this character embraces the call to action and the call to become a hero. And it's so fun to me that Bilbo, in turn, becomes a framing device for the Lord of the Rings, and he's sort of present to pass it on to Frodo. And I was looking, you look at the time frame, and like this comes out in 37, and then Lord of the Rings is in the 50s. So Tolkien sort of aged up the story along with the age of his audience. So he was like, all the kids who read my books when I first read The Hobbit when I first released it are now, 20 years older. So I need to age this up now and make it an adult story. And it's so fascinating to me the way that shaped Lord of the Rings and its relationship to The Hobbit. And now that we're so far away from that, I think it's easy to forget the idea of like, hey, my readers are now older. You know what I mean? Because like now it's just readers of all ages have been reading this thing for 100 years, but he didn't know it was going to be like that at the time.
I was mentioning when I read it, I was like very young. I was like 8 years old when I read The Hobbit, and I appreciated it so much more than The Lord of the Rings at the time, because The Lord of the Rings was just too much, too complex, too nuanced. Yeah. And it's funny to say that like Lord of the Rings is very nuanced, but at the same time, like it wasn't the like romping adventure that I
totally agree. As a kid, I picked up Fellowship after reading The Hobbit. I remember thinking, like, I think my parents were like, hey, if you liked The Hobbit, you should read Fellowship of the Ring. I was like, okay, I love The Hobbit. Let's do it. And I remember picking it up and being like, I don't know if I like this.
I like the Shire stuff. I remember like blowing through the Shire stuff.
Yeah, it was interesting, but like it was not written in the same fun way. It was not as approachable. There was a lot more complex and like kind of dry at times. It's written like it's being written by a professor of philology to some extent. As much as I came to love Tolkien's prose, it's not as approachable for a kid by design. But I think that was a stumbling block for me from making that transition.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about the relationship of the characters and nature, because I think that comes up often. We talked about it definitely in our Lord of the Rings coverage a bunch. In this story, we flash by a lot of really important things that would be later touched on more in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Things like Rivendell and with Elrond, and like we get this character, and we like Elrond. He's an interesting elf, but he's there and gone in a chapter. I think might see him again near the end.
I like the way it mentions like, he's a key figure in many other tales that don't come into this one.
That's really fun.
Cool.
Yeah. And then the mentioning of like to talk about the framing too of the whole story and the playful nature of the narrator, the way that he's like, there is a battle of 5 armies that's coming eventually, but we'll get to that near the end of the book. We'll get to that
in a minute. Yeah, foreshadowing. Which you hear that battle of 5 armies. Ooh, like that's exciting as a kid, and you read that. As any reader, I think it's exciting when you hear that.
Yeah. So and then tying everything to nature, like the elves seems like of course the elves are very nature associated in the Lord of the Rings, but something about here, they're like singing and frolicking in the woods, and it's
a lot
much more like
fae, it seems like to me.
Yeah, I can see that for sure.
Especially the wood elves.
Yeah, and they talk about the dwarves a lot with like the earth and the mountain and the rock, and like those. They I think at one point they talk about the trolls being of the mountain, like being a part like a
yeah. Well, when they get turned to stone, it's actually said that they are returning to stone, because it's referencing old mythology where trolls of myth are formed from the stone itself. So he's referencing like actual myth when it comes to them. And I feel like the trolls we see later are less that, or maybe I'm just thinking of the movies. Trolls in the movies are not like that. Although maybe in the Hobbit movies, I'm talking about like Lord of the Rings movies, we see all kinds of different trolls.
Cave troll in the Fellowship, yeah. I don't know. It's a different kind of troll, I think, but I'm not a, I don't know the lore that well to know the difference between the different trolls. So yeah, keeping the nature theme, we do get these like pure beings that are like only motivated by nature too, which like the eagles, like learning more about the eagles in the Hobbit is obviously a big deal to understanding the Lord of the Rings eagles and like what goes on with the eagles there. And it's basically stated that the eagles won't get involved unless they feel that like nature is being soiled in some way. Like the orcs, or sorry, in this case, the goblins are like corruption. They represent corruption and like taking down the purity of nature and a lot of that kind of stuff.
The trees are getting burnt down, right? At this point, so I don't know if that influences it. So let me back up a little bit. I want to touch on the opening of the dwarves arriving at the house. This was so winning to me as a kid. I loved it. You know, it reminds me of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. They're all showing up. They're fun. But then you get Thorin Oakenshield, who's really serious, and he's got this like really cool backstory. You got Gandalf there, who's a mysterious, wise figure. He's the archetypal mentor type figure. And then you get, in my opinion, the greatest fantasy song of all time, and the Dungeons Deep song. I think this is the best song in all of fantasy. I mean, like, I think I would be open to hearing some other contenders, but I think this is it. This is my favorite song in all of Lord of the Rings, in all of The Hobbit. This is my number one song. I absolutely love this thing. And when this song was in the trailer for the original Hobbit movie, I had chills, and I was so excited because I love this song.
I have chills thinking about it.
Yeah, it's so good.
Right now, yeah. I have no question. It's my favorite as well. And when they did that for the film, and I think it plays, like they sing it in the film, but I think it also plays during the end credits. And it's just, it's incredible. I was going to mention this when we get to Unexpected Journey, but when that trailer came out for Unexpected Journey, I told everyone that it was going to be my favorite movie of all time. I was like, this is about to be the greatest movie that I've ever seen. That's how excited I was. So that's a little teaser to what we're going to talk about next week when we get to the first movie.
I'm really interested to see what you think of that animated film. We'll have to touch on it a little bit in the main coverage, just maybe in reference to the movies that we will then watch. But
Sure.
I also want to think about what we would do differently. Since we're covering this book, me and you have thought about adaptations a lot. If we were to be at least like consultants on a major adaptation for The Hobbit, how would we advise them to change things so that you don't run into a lot of the problems that ended up plaguing Peter Jackson's movies?
Yeah. I've been thinking about this for like 10 years, so I have a lot of answers already. So we'll talk about this next
we'll
week.
have to talk about it in our movie episodes, and that's going to be something we'll hit on our guests to talk about some too. Okay, so anything else from this opening? I mean, there's a lot here. Again, we're going to kind of, move through this plot kind of quickly, but we'll have plenty of opportunities to talk about it more in the future. One thing I thought was of note is the song. They're getting like taken by goblins down into the dark, and it's a really kind of dark, like scary moment. But it's broken up with this song about down to Goblin Town, and it's got these like onomatopoeia, crack the bones, and like snap and crackle and pop, and it's like there's a poetry to it that is fun and playful that lightens the tone a little bit, so it's not quite as scary as I think it otherwise would have been for kids.
Still terrifying to think of like sleeping in a cave and like everybody the ponies being taken and then everybody just being like jumped.
Well, the
basically.
ponies get I think all the ponies get killed several times.
Several times, yeah. The ponies don't have very good luck this journey.
No, ponies don't do well. And then we get Riddles in the Dark, which let's take a moment to talk about Riddles in the Dark. Absolutely amazing scene. One of the moments, sometimes I wouldn't watch the entire movie, but I would watch through the Riddles in the Dark scene because that was my favorite. I love the game of riddles that they play with each other. It's so good. In the animated version of The Hobbit, that version of Gollum is the one that will always kind of be first in my mind, which is wild considering Andy Serkis's Gollum is so iconic now. I still go back to that one because that's the first one that I saw and it imprinted on me. And this moment where he's out paddling in his little weird boat in the lake, and he comes to the shore, and they have this back and forth of riddles, and he's so menacing. It's referenced that he's eaten goblins, like these scary goblins we've been seeing. Like this creature eats them. And I don't know. It's just I was so unnerved by Gollum. I had no idea what he was, and then all the weight of the ring and its importance.
Well, that is interesting too, because to talk about the first time that we read it. You had no idea how important the ring was. I did. I had seen Fellowship, and so I was like, oh, this is an extremely important item that he's just found outside of the fact that there's this riddle, this danger going on with this Gollum creature.
But what's cool is it's all there. Like the influence of the ring on Gollum's mind is something that was brought back in revision. We talked about it. It's a revision, but it doesn't matter ultimately if you're experiencing it any time after the 50s, essentially, because when you're reading it for the first time, it's there. And so that was how it was for me. And even though I knew there was something called the Lord of the Rings, and I think my parents told me that it's about that ring. So like I knew that, but that's it, you know? But the importance of this magic item was there, and like all the magic items they encounter, like Glamdring and you know, like all these cool swords and like the mithril and like, man, that I love that stuff as a kid, and like it just lit my imagination on fire about how cool magic items could be, and then also the way it ties into mythology. You know, Sword in the Stone was something I grew up watching, and so I'm thinking of Excalibur, and then I'm thinking of Glamdring and Sting and all this stuff.
Well, and they even talk right away about how like these swords have the history and the orcs fear it, so someone wielded these back in the day, and that like gives you so much.
And when the Goblin King recognizes the sword and is like, he gets all mad, like it's so cool.
Right. The Riddles in the Dark portion is definitely the most memorable for me, especially growing up. Like, it's what I would come back to when I would think of The Hobbit. And I was thinking this time about how this is another moment where Tolkien is doing that thing that he did in The Hobbit that he doesn't in The Lord of the Rings, where he's kind of tying this world into our world. Like, these riddles existed in our world that he pulls in to have Gollum ask and have Bilbo ask, and they're also like, you probably already know the answer to this one, so Bilbo asks an easy one.
I totally didn't.
yeah. Dude, some of those were, even today.
Maybe in the 50s you are familiar with these riddles, but I was not.
I've read these stories many times, and each time I remember the easy ones, and I remember a few of the bigger ones, but there are definitely some where I was like, what's the answer to this one again? I forget.
Time is one that always sticks with me. I love the way this actually is echoed later in the Smaug conversation. And this is like some of my favorite stuff from Tolkien is these two characters testing each other, finding out things about each other, trying to outwit one another. So good. And it's like almost like this is training for Bilbo for what comes later.
Yep. Well, I also love that Bilbo, like, the time answer specifically, like, he accidentally falls in. It's like
more
there's
time,
fate
more time.
The fate is, like, putting its hand on the scales for Bilbo so many times that you're just like, he just happened to say the correct thing to a random riddle of all the possibilities, what the answer could have been.
Yeah. Okay, and let's talk about Bjorn real quick. He's a character that I do not believe is in the animated film at all. He gets cut. But really interesting because it's this weird blend of, like, children's book. Like, he has, like, talking dogs that like serve them food, and like a lamb comes in chatting with them, and like all of these like fun creatures. He is he transforms into a bear, but like he gets sucked into the story, so Gandalf's able to fool him by bringing in more and more dwarves over time, like very clever, right? But then Bjorn sneaks out while they're sleeping there and goes and finds a goblin and a warg to confirm their story, and they're like, what happened to them? And he's like, take a look, and he shows outside, and there's the head of a fucking goblin and the skin of a warg. So he skinned a warg and beheaded a goblin, and I'm like, wait a minute, it's a children's book?
And he displayed this
and displayed
as a
it,
warning.
it's like up on his like fence or something. I'm like, damn. So very interesting character, the skin changer too, who I want to touch on again as he comes back in the final act of this book and has a pretty important role.
I was making a point of talking about the nature too, and this is another character that has that nature
for sure.
twist to it.
Kind of a Tom Bombadil type, but very different too, though.
He likes these characters and, these like mythological, seemingly immortal Santa Claus-like characters. And it's very interesting what these kinds of characters do to stories. We've talked about this in the past as well. And like the motivations and when entities will get involved and when they won't.
It seems like Bjorn just hates goblins and orcs.
Yeah, but ultimately, I think a lot of it comes down to orcs mean anti-nature, and all these entities are so tied to nature. And I think it's an interesting commentary because of, he saw the horrors of war and what man was capable of.
Well, it's even said in this book that goblins went on to create mass machines of war. So, like, I think the direct tie between goblins and the German war machine, I think, is there. And that's what other critics have said at the time. So in industrialization, we know, like, Tolkien, not a fan.
Yeah. And ultimately, nature, it seems like, is on the side of good, is almost a part of what Tolkien's getting at here with, like, eagles being involved and these people, these entities that normally wouldn't get involved. But then at the last second...
You see how that leads to the hippie movement and, like, all these environmentalists taking on Lord of the Rings and saying, yeah, this is our stuff. even if like Tolkien himself didn't love that.
And I think it still is, yeah. And I do think it is. I think that's been the case.
Yeah.
It is true. He whether he wants to admit it or not, that's what he was writing. Like those sensibilities are the same.
Yeah, and it that goes to a broader conversation about like the way certain works get so big that they become a piece of culture. We talk about this with Stephen King a lot, or we should. Stephen King is like a piece of Americana now. As much as he is a living author, still writing, but like he is like ingrained into our culture. And The Lord of the Rings is like that, but for like all of Western culture, maybe just entire world culture. Like such an influential figure. And at a certain point, those works are bigger than the man. Those works are bigger than any prejudices the man might have had, any political beliefs the man might have had, because they have influenced so many people who have taken them and run with them. And the one thing I do admire about Tolkien, I mean, there are many things, but something I do admire about Tolkien is he fully embraced that. And that's why I think he didn't like allegory, because he found allegory reductive. He wanted people to be able to interpret whatever they wanted to from it. And that's what we've seen people do.
And I think we've realized over time, like I remember in our early coverages with when he made that comment, we felt like it was a very strong statement to say he was against allegory. But I think it's what you're saying. I think it's more, he wants people to be more open to interpretation. And
he doesn't want people to reduce it and say, look at the dwarves, they are Jews. Like, he doesn't want that. Even though, like, you can argue, and he's admitted that he was influenced by it, he didn't want things reduced that way.
Ultimately, you can't escape the influences of your time, basically.
And yeah, maybe that's wrong to like use it as an influence and then try and tell people not to make that comparison. That's certainly valid. Let me read the next paragraph here so we can keep moving through the plot. The company enters the Black Forest of Mirkwood without Gandalf, who has other responsibilities. In Mirkwood, Bilbo first saves the dwarves from giant spiders, and then from the dungeons of the Wood Elves. Nearing the Lonely Mountain, the travelers are welcomed by the human inhabitants of Lake Town, who hope the dwarves will fulfill prophecies of Smaug's demise. The expedition reaches the mountain and finds the secret door. The dwarves send a reluctant Bilbo inside to scout the dragon's lair. He steals a great cup, and while conversing with Smaug, spots a gap in the ancient dragon's armor. The enraged dragon, deducing that Lake Town has aided the intruders, flies off to destroy the town. A thrush overhears Bilbo's report of Smaug's vulnerability and tells Lake Town resident Bard. Smaug wreaks havoc on the town until Bard fires an arrow into Smaug's hollow spot, killing the dragon. Okay, so before we get to Smaug, let's talk about stuff in Mirkwood, maybe. Let's talk about the barrel riding scene.
Interesting to introduce elves, the high elves, and then also the wood elves, right? And the differences. And it seems that there's some corruption going on within Mirkwood, obviously, right? And I think we get confirmation of that. I wonder also if the necromancer being added to the end, and sort of that's where Gandalf was. I wonder if that was also something that was added in to kind of connect to Lord of the Rings.
I think it was. Like that kind of connective tissue stuff, and then a lot of references to stuff from different ages was later amended to line up with stuff he had been writing in the Silmarillion and so forth.
Yeah. But it seems like creatures of dark are there, and wood elves and elves in general are champions of nature sort of prevailing. And it seems like they're maybe even being a little corrupted, but having to deal with this like forest that's being overrun by giant like evil spiders and stuff, I guess. And I don't know. It seems like you don't touch the water, like, because what's his name fell in and he falls asleep. It seems like a very dark and ominous place for elves.
Mirkwood definitely is. It's all
and for elves to be inhabiting, though, and that idea.
Yeah, it's like kind of weird, right? But I guess because they're beings of the forest, they can coexist in a way with it, at least survive. So parts of that stand out for me from here. There's a moment where Bilbo climbs to the top of a tree as a scout, and he's surrounded by these butterflies, and he's feeling the breeze, and he's seeing the tops, and he's like this green like ocean of leaves around him. And I just remember that moment was so beautiful. It's in the animated film, and it always struck me. And it's like a cool lesson on perspective, I think, of like if you can just get above things sometimes, like you can get a whole new perspective on it. And it made Mirkwood, as much as it was still scary, it was like knowing that was up there, like lessens that a little bit.
You know, it's funny. This time I didn't think anything of it, but when you said that, it kind of reminded me of how I felt when I first read it, and I did find there to be like a lot of significance to it, like that.
What's just beyond our perception if we could just see it, that kind of thing. And then they get captured by these elves, and it's interesting because like you said, like I kind of viewed the elves as like the enemy here for a while, but then like Tolkien does a few times say like, you know, they don't treat their prisoners that badly because they're not orcs. Like they're pretty good. They're elves. You know, it's just kind of a misunderstanding. But then I love the idea of Bilbo just sneaking around, invisible. You know, like living there for a while, just like stealing things, and then like he wears the ring a lot, and then the barrel scene. So like this scene is. It's I don't know. It's so funny that like I feel like it gets completely overplayed in the movie, but like. I thought this was so fun as a kid. The idea of riding these barrels down the river, it just really appealed to me. I wanted to do it. It seemed fun. So this was a moment that always stood out to me as a kid, even though I think now it doesn't seem like that important of a moment, but I loved it.
Yeah. Like you said, I like the fact that Bilbo is like organizing and orchestrating it all, and they're like sort of jumping down.
Well, we're seeing him rise to different challenges, right? We see him, you know, rise to fight the spiders. We're seeing him, you know, beat Gollum in a test of riddles. We're seeing him, you know, have to like figure out a way to get to save the dwarves and get them out. Like he continues to be challenged and rise to the occasion.
Bilbo takes a huge step in besting Gollum and escaping, and then he's telling all the dwarves about it, and they're loving it. They think it's amazing that he's done this, and they're seeing him in a different light, and he starts to see himself in a different light, and I think that allows him to have the courage to fight the spider and defeat the spider, and that gives him another step up in his confidence and him like developing as a character and as a hero, really. And then, you know, we get to this scene where he's saving all the dwarves. Like he's realizing what he is capable of, and I think that's always really fun to see, especially for a children's story, to be these lessons to be told.
And then they go to Lake Town. They get welcomed and sort of supported by the people of Lake Town, and they're like, hey, you know, he's going to come, he's going to turn the rivers to gold, and, you know, this is great. They go to the mountain, and Bilbo, I think, is riding high on that confidence, and he's feeling like, man, I'm for real, I'm the burglar, you know. Gandalf has left now, by the way. The mentor has left, so you're sort of left to your own devices, and you have to save yourself, because Gandalf saves them several times early on.
And the dwarves have borderline made Bilbo their leader. They're like they're looking to him for what to do next.
It's like him and Thorin are like co-leaders for sure.
Yeah.
So they send him in, and I think like he's scared for sure, but he's got this confidence, and he goes in and he starts talking to Smaug. And this version of a dragon just imprinted on me. Like, I love this version. Such a great moment in fantasy. One of the great, I think, all-time scenes. We talked about Riddles in the Dark is great. I think the moment where Bilbo and Smaug first start talking to each other is right up there. You know, maybe even more important. It's just so good. I love the way it's overconfidence on Bilbo's part that actually gets the better of him, because Smaug is smarter than he realizes, and he keeps kind of like playfully throwing out these little riddles because he thinks that like he can do that and get away with it. And Smaug like starts figuring out stuff about him. He's like, well, you're the 13th one because you've mentioned the lucky number. You've mentioned barrel rider, so you're you know, the people of Lake Town helped you get here, and like he's able to start sussing out all this stuff that Bilbo thinks he's being really clever about. And so I love that because it just shows how smart this ancient dragon is, and you know, at the same time, it's just being menacing as hell and huge. And then I don't know. I love the way that he like knows the very weight of his entire horde. So like as soon as a cup is missing, he knows it. Just so many good things here.
And that was another hubris moment too, right? Like he brings this cup just to prove it to the dwarves. Yep. And then basically incites the violence and rage of Smaug, and Smaug
who goes and destroys a town. It probably kills hundreds, if not thousands, of people. So there's that. There's that, Bilbo.
Yep.
Yeah. Not saying it's completely his fault or anything, but you know, he was a little cavalier. You know, and I like that that's set up though, because like you said, like he's riding high at this moment. He's got all this confidence, and I think this is a moment of like, oh shit, maybe I shouldn't have been so confident. And he even realizes that. But Smaug gets killed by Bard, and I remember even as a kid being kind of shocked that it happened so quickly.
I was bummed. As a kid, I remember being like, no, the dwarves and Bilbo have to defeat the dragon.
Yeah, not Bard, like some random guy who we just met. with his black arrow. I don't know. It's interesting because, like, I'm fine with the way he goes down, but it just feels like it happens very quickly. And Smaug is so menacing and so immense and impressive. But it does leave the door open for the Battle of Five Armies, which otherwise wouldn't really have room in the story if we dragged out the Smaug stuff.
Oh, I get it. And today I understand it, but as a kid I remember just being bummed, like that because I thought the heroes, because like I said, it's sort of subversive. You think the heroes that we've been following will defeat the dragon, that doesn't happen, and there's this power vacuum that's left behind, and it gets more complicated.
Well, they're inside the mountain, and they're like getting all this armor and gear, and they're like getting like decked out in the stuff of their ancestors. And they're in this like defensible position, and they're afraid that the dragon's going to return. And you keep thinking like, yeah, he's going to return, and they're going to have to fight him. No, he gets killed by Bard.
And this gets back to that other thing where like each character and each really scenario that's introduced is one chapter. So like we get Smaug, we get like the introduction of Smaug with Bilbo entering and sort of speaking with them, and then he comes out, and that's when he freaks out. That's when Smaug freaks out, goes, attacks the village, and gets killed. So it's really like we have Smaug for 2 chapters, even though it feels like he would be the final confrontation, or he would be like across many different chapters. It's very self-contained, and yeah, interesting way to tell a story for sure. It feels pacing-wise really quick, but I think you want that in a children's novel, right? Like
yeah, you have to keep it moving. So I listened to this as an audiobook.
Oh, me too. I meant to mention this. Yeah,
and so what's funny is I think I'm sure I've listened to this as an audiobook before, but I listened to it with a different narrator. I didn't look up the previous narrator, but the new audiobook I listened to was Andy Serkis. This is a recently released version of it. I guess he recorded himself doing a reading of it for a charity stream or charity something.
I remember hearing about that. Yeah. Maybe during COVID or
it was during COVID, yes. Yeah. And then I guess it was successful, and the publishers ended up wanting a version of it, so he re-recorded it for the audiobook.
Yeah. That's the one I listened to as well. I was really taken by it.
I thought it was good, but I remember there being things I liked better in the previous audiobook. I think there are certain things Andy Serkis, he has a very gruff voice. And
he did all right with Gollum. Like, it was fine, like that. Like,
well, I was going to say, of course, the Riddles in the Dark section, when you get Gollum's voice, you're like, holy shit, because it's literally Gollum from the movies. Yeah. Right. So it's very obviously very, very good. I think he does a very good Smaug. But I just wanted to give context so that when the Raven shows up and starts conversing with Thorin, I'm going to blame this all on Andy Serkis because the way he pronounced it, but that's Rock, son of cock. And I thought that was pretty funny.
That didn't even register in my brain. I love that.
I am Rock, son of cock.
I love that. Hey.
And I'm like, aren't we all? Yeah.
Oh man.
We do get a lot of talking animals, right? Including these ravens, including the thrush. And you're talking about all these nature represented by these talking animals and dogs that can walk on their hind legs, apparently with Bjorn. All right, you ready for the final paragraph?
Yeah, I'm ready.
When the dwarves take possession of the mountain, Bilbo finds the Arkenstone, the most treasured heirloom of Thorin's family, and hides it away. The Wood Elves and Lakemen request compensation for Lake Town's destruction and settlement of old claims on the treasure. When Thorin refuses to give them anything, they besiege the mountain. However, Thorin manages to send a message to his kinfolk in the Iron Hills and reinforces his position. Bilbo slips out and gives the Arkenstone to the besiegers, hoping to head off a war. When they offer the jewel to Thorin in exchange for treasure, Bilbo reveals how they obtained it. Thorin, furious at what he sees as betrayal, banishes Bilbo, and battle seems inevitable when Thorin's second cousin arrives with an army of dwarf warriors. Gandalf reappears to warn all of an approaching army of goblins and wargs. The dwarves, men, and elves band together, but only with the timely arrival of the eagles and Bjorn do they win the climactic battle of 5 armies. Thorin is fatally wounded and reconciles with Bilbo before he dies. Bilbo accepts only a small portion of his share of the treasure, having no want or need for more, but still returns home a very wealthy hobbit roughly a year and a month after he first left. Years later, he writes the story of his adventures. Okay, so let's back up. This, I think, is a really interesting part of this novel. It gets into some like political things going on. We see, as you were talking about, these dwarves that we've been with and have been our friends and we've spent all this time alongside, they get corrupted by the wealth of the mountain. And when they say no to Bard, it was shocked me as a kid. I was like, how, like, of course you should share your wealth with them. Like, they helped you. First off, it's not like they did nothing. They literally helped you when you were like coming out of the barrels.
Well, not to mention they also killed the dragon.
And they killed the dragon, that you would not have you would not have the treasure if they had not done that. The idea that you can't give them what they asked for, like 1/12 of it, and they're like, no.
They literally just want what they need to repair the town.
Yeah. Ridiculous. And they call it the dragon sickness, I think it's called, but it's greed, right? And that's really interesting, right? The idea of this and like the wealth and what seems to be the prize at the end of the journey causing so much problems. It does say something interesting about wealth in general and about money and about the effect it has on people and society.
And one of my favorite parts, like I said, is that lesson that's being told to children, right? Is that like you need to suss out what you believe to be right and wrong and not just go along with what your friends are thinking or what these, and like it's clear that most people have the moral compass to understand that like you would give the certain amount of money, and then he literally betrays the dwarves, rightfully, obviously.
It's a big moment, right? And like I wouldn't have believed this from Bilbo if we hadn't seen what he'd been through, I think, to this point, and like the knowledge that he saved the dwarves, and like he has convinced himself, rightly so, that he knows what's right and wrong here, and that he's willing to act on it in a moment that makes me really like Bilbo, honestly. Because he knows what it's going to do to his friendship.
Totally. And it's like it could potentially cost him his life.
Yeah.
He realizes. But one of my favorite parts of the entire novel is when Gandalf just so happens to be there to witness all of this when he hands over the what is it called? The Arkstone?
Arkenstone, heart of the mountain.
Yeah, and he hands this over and gives them basically leverage against Thorin, and then Gandalf is there to be like, I made the right choice, you're the best. So basically.
Well, also, Gandalf loves to do this, where like Thorin says something like, well, if Gandalf was here, I'd curse him for giving us you as our burglar. And of course, Gandalf like throws off his robe and he's like, Gandalf is here.
I am here. Very dramatic.
So dramatic.
Waiting for his entrance, his dramatic entrance.
All right, Gandalf.
What if he was here?
One thing I noted, because I had completely forgot about this character in the movies, but I was like, okay, where's this goblin? So I figured out, and then I did some reading. There is a goblin or an orc. I don't know. I mean, I know they are different, but I often lose track of which is which. There's this goblin/orc named Bolg. Bolg is one of the leaders of this army, if not the leader of the army that attacks of the goblins. And there's like goblins and bats and wargs and all of that, right? And they fight him off, and it talks about how he has these bodyguards. And it ends up being the dwarves that do battle directly with the bodyguards, and they get surrounded. And while they're fighting, Thorin is trying to kill Bolg and gets mortally wounded. That's why those are the wounds he's dying from at the end. It's from attacking Bolg. Bolg is then killed by Bjorn, who shows up as like a giant version of a bear, and he's like ripping into the army and like single-handedly just like tearing apart all these different orcs and goblins. Amazing. Now I did some reading. Bolg is the son of a goblin named Azog, or orc, one or the other. And Azog originally died at this battle called the Battle of Azanulbazar. So that battle is then brought into the movie, and they have Balin be present at the battle. I'm not sure if he was present at the battle in the book.
You're talking about the movie that we're getting to.
The movie we're going to get, the Peter Jackson.
Okay, and you're talking about like the white orc that's like introduced in the movie? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So Azog in the movie is the father of Bolg, and Azog in the book dies at the battle that we mentioned, and his son, Bolg, is the one who leads the armies. So they've taken a character who originally died at this other battle, and they bring him into the movie. So that's going to be something we're going to be talking about as we see some of the changes. I was trying to look out for the characters and figure out, like, where do they get these from? I think that's what happened, is what I understand.
I will admit, when we get to this movie, like I haven't seen this original An Unexpected Journey more than maybe twice. I think I saw it once in theaters, once out. And so it'll be really, I don't remember a lot of it. And I've said it in past episodes, like I'm going to be going in with like really open expectations, and I'm really going to try to suss out what exactly happened here, what we like and what we don't like. Because I think that there's obviously a rhetoric about the Hobbit films at this point, but I think we should try not to bring in the baggage and try to just like
I don't know, man. You say similar things to me about the prequels in Star Wars, and I struggle, man.
There are some, don't get me wrong, Episode 2 Attack of the Clones is by far the worst Star Wars movie.
I don't want to get into that, but like my point is I have a lot of preconceived notions that I have built up over the years about these movies. I'm going to come in with them. I remember dissatisfaction. I remember there being times of things that I liked and thinking that it was getting sort of a bad rap. We'll touch on those as we get to those.
I think that the narrative behind Battle of Five Armies and Desolation of Smaug gets lumped in with Unexpected Journey, but we'll see. I want to see like how I feel about them as individuals rather than as a trilogy.
Okay.
So we'll see how it goes.
So I want to talk about Thorin's death scene. This made me tear up as a kid. It's always been tragic to me. I love that he's had this moment where he cast off Bilbo and said, I never want to see you again. I'm gonna, like if you stick around, I'm gonna, take that armor off of you. And
I think he told him to he's like, I send him off without any friend, and he goes without any friendship or something like that. Basically saying that like there is no.
So heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And then he wakes up and he's fallen. He's like gotten knocked out. I believe he gets hit by a stone, gets knocked out, but he falls asleep or is unconscious with the ring on. So he stays invisible. So only when he wakes up does he take the ring off and get found. And then he gets brought to the tent. And we get these lines from Thorin, and I think he gives some of the best lines in the entire book, and thus some of the best lines and most iconic lines, at least, in all of fantasy. And he says, and these are his final words, so I think that adds even more import to them. He says, "If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell." I just love those lines. I think that's the kind of stuff that, say what you will about Lord of the Rings, like that's a awesome sentiment, and I think it's one that champions peace and friendship over greed and violence. That has got broad appeal, and the idea that that's where Thorin comes back to, and there's a lot of regret in that, which I think on its surface you don't realize this is a character who has done the opposite of what he's saying, and now on his deathbed realizes his mistake. That makes it very, very powerful for me.
Yeah, and he also, in addition to those words before that, he like apologizes to Bilbo for everything he said, and he said, you were in the right, you did the right thing, and then goes on to say that. And I do think it's worth noting that that's kind of how we see the elves in this story. The elves do sort of seem to be like dancing around and appreciating life and not worried. There doesn't seem to be a lot of greed there.
But the hobbits too, you could say.
The hobbits, yeah. And it's interesting to just think of that. The elves are willing to fight for that right, to be able to still enjoy their lives like that. So it's a right to party, yeah, like the Beastie Boys. And so like that's what the elves ultimately. That's what I think their theme song, and that's what I think of when I think of them as the Beastie Boys.
That's what they were singing.
Yeah,
got to hear the elves sing.
Yeah, and yeah, that sentiment of like enjoying life is just like it's so important to come back to, as much as it feels like sort of very obvious. I see it, so we all see it so often. Is like people prioritizing not enjoying life just for the sake of whatever they get wrapped up in.
Yeah, just such a great moment. So just a couple other things I want to touch on. Bjorn becomes a great chief, and his descendants. He's kind of like the leader of this area, and his descendants, some of them can even skin change. It says that like some of them were great people and some of them were not so great. And I was thinking like, I think Bjorn goes on to found House Mormont. That's kind of the way I was thinking.
Got it. Yeah. Bear Island, right?
Yeah. I think Martin was influenced, and whether or not Bjorn in particular was in his mind when he was designing the Mormonts, I don't know. But they're kind of described as having a physical appearance that's kind of similar to Bjorn in this book.
Yeah, I don't think you can understate the obviously the influence for all fantasy. Like,
well, in this Battle of Five Armies, like the fighting and the having to come together to fight a common foe, like that's all through Game of Thrones. Like, I mean, that's absolutely there. So
I did also love, obviously, the Battle of Five Armies isn't just like a free-for-all. It's, men, dwarves, and elves all coming together, and what the good versus the evil. And, we've already talked about the problematic elements of the races being evil, but like the although they're quibbling over the gold and all this other stuff, when there's a common enemy, they like band together for the greater good, it seems.
Right. Now, we do get a description of what Gandalf was up to while he was away. This may have been something added in the revised editions, I'm not sure, but that he had joined together in a council of wizards, and they drove the necromancer away, who we later find out, I guess, is Sauron. And he was driven away temporarily from the lands, but and like you said, when he gets driven away, Mirkwood gets less like evil, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about. I was looking at the map. I've been watching Rings of Power. I won't say any spoilers or anything, but just the idea of like the areas on the map that have been like, oh, there's some darkness, some sketchiness over here. Let's either like, and it's sort of ignored often, where it's like everyone could band together and just like snuff the stuff out. But anyway, being in Mirkwood, building up his power, it seems, and then obviously we know that he's gonna shift down to like Mordor area. His stronghold for Lord of the Rings, which takes place, like 100 years after this or something, like 50, 60 or 70 years after The Hobbit?
I think I'm not sure exactly of the amount. It's something like that. All right, man. So then we just get the final return home where Bilbo... also, by the way, Philly and Killy die in the battle.
Off screen.
We don't hear a lot about it.
That's another thing to note. Obviously, going into the movies, most of Battle of Five Armies takes place off screen.
Yeah, so because he gets knocked out during it, we see some of it. We hear about some of it later. Ultimately, it's only like 5 or 10 pages, probably total. Pretty short, and then that gets expanded into an entire movie. Now, there's a lot in here, so I can see why they thought to do it. But again, we'll talk about that movie when we get there. Okay, so yeah, we get the return home, which is an important piece of the hero's journey. And as he goes, people leave his company along the way, and he arrives back at home basically with Gandalf, and then Gandalf leaves right before he gets all the way home. And then he gets all the way home, and he finds out that like other hobbits are there, like trying to sell off his stuff, and Bag End's being ransacked. And he has to prove that he isn't legally dead. And there's like this big kind of legal battle that goes on over time where he has to buy his own stuff back. It's just funny because like not only has he changed, the world he left wanted to write him off. And he has to sort of assert himself as he comes back.
Well, we know the ways of hobbits too, as to like they look down on anybody who does go on an adventure.
Well, but I just came back to like how much this is echoed in Lord of the Rings, right? Like with the desolation of the Shire, like returning home and having stuff be wrong, and then having to like assert yourself and fight to get it back, sort of thing. Like it's a simplified version of it here, but so much of this, the beats of this are directly echoed in Lord of the Rings.
It's very true. Something about Bilbo appreciating and enjoying the company of elves and wizards and dwarves who come to visit him more than hanging out with his hobbits and that are in town with him and stuff. Like I love this idea of like the peaceful times for Bilbo between his large adventures, and then just like sort of carrying on these friendships with all these different people that he met along the way and everything. I've always thought that was really nice.
Yeah, it is. And, you return to that homey feel and all is kind of back being right in the world. And then you get Balin come by at the end and hang out, him and Gandalf and Bilbo, and they get to talk about their past and the adventures they had. And it's just a cool moment. He gets to write his story, and, we know eventually he's going to get involved with Frodo, but I always just love Bilbo as a character, and his journey is so neat and tidy in a way, and it so perfectly encapsulates the hero's journey that there is something just sort of appealing about it. So yeah, I love the story. A lot of it is super nostalgic for me, and I think it always will be. But yeah, this is a special one for me, and I love this book. Even though as I was reading it, I could like tell you exactly what was about to happen the entire time, because like I know this story so well. I still just had a good time with it. So highly recommend, I guess. Ultimately is where I'm at.
I'm gonna go watch that trailer now for the Unexpected Journey.
Yeah. So speaking of, we are gonna be tackling the first movie coming up here soon, but we're also going to be doing the animated version. I guess I'm not sure on which one we're going to do first, but we're going to be doing them pretty close to each other. If you wanted to hear that animated episode, which we will be releasing this month, you're going to go over to Patreon, patreon.com/inktofilm, and you can find that bonus episode and all the other bonus episodes we've released over the years. Speaking of Patreon, I wanted to shout out some new patrons we have. It's been a little while since we've done this. Alexander O., Adam G., and Gloria C., thank you for becoming patrons. In case we haven't said it yet, shout out to you. We appreciate your support.
If you wanted to help out this podcast in another way, we love rating and reviewing. That helps the podcast out a ton on whatever platform you listen on. It really helps to get the word out.
Yeah, I noticed that we actually have enough ratings on Spotify now to where it shows up. Our little rating is on there. So yeah, whatever app you're on, most of them have a way to do it. We'd appreciate that. Connect with us on social media. We are at Ink2Film on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. We also have a group on Goodreads. It's like a reading discussion group. You could join that. We're all over the place, and we'd love to connect with you wherever you prefer. Come find us. All right, we are about to take our own journey across multiple films with many guests that we're going to bring along as a fellowship of sorts to help us along the way, and we hope that you, the listener, will join us as well. And until next time,
keep adapting.